It looks like the internet is back on, so it should be working and recorded for us. Matthew chapter 24. Does anybody have any Bible questions for tonight? Any Bible questions at all? Well, I like the plan that you outlined after Bible class this morning, and I'll say it so that the online audience can hear. On Sunday mornings, our Bible class is going to be focused on an easy applicable message, easier than even saying the word applicable. One that has a life lesson, or we can apply to today, and then we'll focus on, after we finish the parallel gospels, it looks like we're going to go into the prophets, some of the prophets that y'all haven't touched on yet from the Old Testament, to just finish out your study of the Old Testament, and then eventually on Wednesday nights it'll be Revelation. That'll be fun. So we're going to diversify the class material a little bit to try to cater to the different types of people that come during the week. So that's going to be fun. But tonight we're in Matthew chapter 24, and we're down to verse 32. But let's give a recap of some high points throughout this chapter. And this is only going to take 2 or 3 minutes for me to do, and then we'll get into the material for tonight. In Matthew 24 and verse 1 and 2, the disciples come to Jesus, and they're going to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus makes just a comment that would be very astounding to them, something that they wouldn't, that would even be shocking to his disciples. And he says, "Do you see not all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." In other words, this temple that you put your trust in, that's the center of your religious life, is going to be destroyed. And his disciples immediately attach this to the coming of Jesus and the end of the age. And so they come to him and they ask him privately, when is this going to happen? In other words, when is this city going to fall? What's going to be the sign of your coming? And when is going to be the end of the age? And what's the sign going to be for the end of the age? And so he goes through and he tells them some signs. He says, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nation's going to rise against nation. But during all this time, you know that the end is not near yet. Now what's interesting, now we know this is talking about the fall of Jerusalem. That's what he introduced at the first of the chapter. But people today say, see here, wars and rumors of wars, the end must be near. Well, not only do they misapply the wars and rumors of wars, but they also don't get the part where it says, and the end will not be yet. Right? That's what he says here in the first few verses. In fact, he starts off by saying, see to it that no one misleads you. And so it's funny, the people that are saying that the end is near, which we know when the end was in the first century, are actually going against this passage by saying that the end is near just because there's wars and rumors of wars. He says in verse 6, that is not the end, in verse 6. But after all these things would happen, and during the time that all these things were taking place, the gospel of the kingdom was being preached to the whole world. And that would be the sign as to when the end would come. And so he says in verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Literally, this word world means inhabited earth, or it's the known world. It's the world that they were familiar with. And so this is not a...
Is there a difference in when you use the world there? Is there a difference? Because I know a lot of people read this and say, what you see there is not, the gospel hadn't been preached everywhere in the world. I mean, there's still places in the world that they haven't heard the gospel.
Right.
So that's not the end. That's not the end. So when you use the word world there, in its interpretations or is it talking about a societal thing, or is it talking about, as we say, the global thing? Or is there where we can distinguish or show a person the difference in that?
Here's how you could show it to them, that it was talking about their world, the known world, where all the Jews were dispersed, which was the Roman Empire. Here's how you can prove that to them. By going to Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23 and showing that they did accomplish that message, that sending that gospel message to their whole world in the first century. And so if they say it's obvious that the gospel hasn't gone out to every creature yet, well, you could say, look at Colossians 1:23. In here Paul says, if indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, made a minister. However Jesus defined that word world in Matthew 24:14, Paul saw it to be accomplished within his day and time. And so that's what I would do, because, not everybody, none of us know Greek, but not everybody have the tools available to look up that word and see how it says inhabited earth or known world as its definition. And so this is another passage that you can show them to demonstrate that the gospel is preached to the whole world. Not only that, but here in the very first part of Colossians chapter 1 and verse 6, he says this, which has come to you. He's talking about the gospel from verse 5. He says, which has come to you just as in all the world. As also it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it had been doing in you also since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth. So here this word world is, and notice if you have a footnote, it will also say inhabited earth on it too. The point being that this word world and the word world in Matthew 24, I believe, are the same word in the Greek. I'm going to check that for you, but it might not be the case, so don't write it down yet. Let's see. One is cosmos, and I bet the other is oikonomai, so I bet it's not the same word in the Greek. But the idea is, the idea of it, though, is the same, is that the gospel is going out into the whole world, and regardless of which specific words you use, it's, it doesn't change the message one bit. Here he says it's going to go to the whole world. In Colossians 1, he says it's going to go to the whole cosmos. And then also he says in Colossians 1, it was preached to every creature. So however Jesus defines this, Paul sees it as taking place within his generation. And so that's how I would answer that without going to a dictionary. I know that he does use this word world in the New Testament, oikonomai, to say that the gospel message had been completed. But I don't have that reference specifically on hand, but I bet I could find it. Romans chapter 10 and verse 18 is the one I'm thinking of. In Romans 10:18, Paul says, "But I say surely they have never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voices gone out to all the earth, and their voices to the ends of the world."
Is that the same use that you have in Mark?
Romans 10:18.
Is that the same word that we have in Mark?
Okay, so Matthew 24:14.
Mark 16, right? Go ye into all the world. The same.
Right. Yeah. Oh, okay. I was thinking about the word creatures. So Matthew 24:14 lines up with Romans 10:18. That word oikonomai is used, and what Gary's talking about, right? Go ye into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. I think that's oikonomai as well. I can do a check on it real quick, but let me see. Mark 16:15. But I know that word creatures that's used in Mark 16 is the one that Paul uses in Colossians 1 to say that's been done. The word world in Mark 16:15 is cosmos. So let me line this up for you in your brain. Matthew 24:15 or Matthew 24:14, the gospel must be preached to all the world. That corresponds to Romans 10:18, where he says that this has taken place. Mark 16:15, he says go to all the world. That lines up to Colossians 1:6. That's the word cosmos in the Greek. And then that last one, preach the gospel to every creature, that's also found in Colossians 1, but that time verse 23. And so the point is, you can look up all these words that are related to the worldwide gospel mission, and the Apostle Paul later confirms that mission was accomplished. So when people say, like particularly Seventh-day Adventists, that's really their thing, and Jehovah's Witnesses as well. They think they're bringing about the end by evangelizing as much as they do. That's one of their primary driving factors in doing so as fervently as they do. And both of their denominations were founded off of some sort of end times expectation or philosophy. There's a book that the Jehovah's Witnesses put out in 1971 called True Peace and Serenity, because the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that in the year 1914 There was 144,000 individuals that were alive at that time that would be alive at the coming of the Lord. And they say in that book, I'm not kidding, in 1970, this book, True Peace and Serenity, it is. We know that we know that Jesus said that it would take place in this generation, and we know He's talking about our generation. And these people born in 1914 really are getting up in years now, and so we know that the coming of the Lord must be relatively close. Exactly, and so they're a denomination that was founded off of a belief of the end times, a particular view of the end times. And same with the Seventh-day Adventists. They believe that Sunday worship is the mark of the beast.
How did they get this generation and put it to 1914?
You are talking the wrong person. I don't know how they do. I don't know how they do that. I guess the same way our brothers think that Jesus coming on the cloud quickly must mean He's going to come very, very fast at some point in the future. Instead of shortly. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the biggest problem with that is John 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was a God. And so the Word was God. However, besides that, a lot of their translations, especially in these almost said a I'll tell you what the word was in a second, and you can laugh with me. But a lot of these passages deal with the end times. They actually do it pretty good. For example, the end of the world or end of the age, they translate the conclusion of this system of things, which, in other words, this order of things at the end of this. And I thought, that's pretty good, but then, when you start talking to them, it gets kind of, they put it here and there. The word that I was going to use is a technical term. I use biology or sociology, something like that. Well, the Greek word that's translated last in the Bible is the word eschatos or eschaton. And so I was going to say the word eschatology, the study of the last things, but I told Gary I wouldn't use those words because they're kind of scary if you've never heard them before. But and it helps it simplify the message to people that have never heard what we believe. But anyways, those are those words you learn at preacher school. So. Right. The Church of England has their own version, and it's the one we all use, King James. Yes, sir.
Going back to Keith's question, was saying how you said determine whether or not it's the world and the Jews, or
right?
The whole cosmos, whatever it is. But if we go back and we read where Paul's writing in Galatians, he said Jesus born of a woman born under the law. His purpose would come to redeem those that was under the law. And then when he was teaching his disciples, with the apostles, when he sent them out, he told them not to go in the ways of the Gentiles and Samaritans. Don't even go that direction. Just go to the lost house of Israel. So that was the world that they was coming.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Even if it's translated cosmos, it can still, in the way that we use words figuratively, you can take a word that has very literal meaning and speak of it in a figurative sense. And that's world as cosmos can be world in a figurative societal sense. And we
right.
use that. The New Testament writers used it.
Oh boy. See, this is, like I told you. No, I'm excited now. So like I told you, this was going to be our 2 to 3 minute introduction. Go to 1 John, let's see, chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, I believe it's where it's at. First John chapter 2 and verse 15 through 17. 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17. And I'm going to look at one more passage after this, then we'll get back to Matthew 24. He says, 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17. He uses the word cosmos here when he's talking about world. He says, do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. Children, I'll read verse 18. It is the last hour. I'll stop there. What's it the last hour of? This world is passing away. I think it's the last hour of the last day of the last days.
Is that the same way Jesus used it in John 3, 15 and 16? For God so loved the
Yes, I agree. For God so loved the world.
in a societal sense. That's figured.
And he talks about, you might remember this, the world above and the world below. And that also is related to the same thing. I've got one more passage for you, though, related to this. It's 1 Corinthians 7, verse 31. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 31. This again is cosmos, cosmos though. He says, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away. The form of this world is passing away. You know, this is why Jesus said, this is why Jesus said this in John 17. I want you to go with me for a moment to John 17. This is just so neat. And like I said, we're chasing rabbits, but this rabbit's got a big white fluffy tail, and it looks like it'd make a good pet. I might have been going a different direction there, but we're going to go make it a good pet. To love it and care it and give it the best carrots it could ever have.
That's
Right, Connie? Okay. I'm from, in Alabama, we chase rabbits for different reasons, but tonight we're going to get a good pet. John 17. Notice what he says here about the world. Let's see. Verse 11, he says, I am no longer in the world. I'm no longer in the cosmos. Now here, let me give you something about Jesus's teachings before the cross, and let me suggest something to you. So in John 4, Jesus says, if you drink of this water, you can have everlasting life. Okay? In John 5, he says, if you hear my words and do them, you pass from death to life. In John 6, he said, you don't have to write this down, I'm just giving you an overview. In John 6, he says, if you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you're never going to taste death. All right? What's the big problem here?
People try to literalize it.
Oh, well, yes, people try to literalize it, but let's think about the time of when he said this. What's the problem?
He's still here. He's still there.
This was before he ever died. This was before he ever resurrected. This was before he ever ascended into heaven. So how could he offer these blessings? See, what he's doing is he's speaking in the present tense, but in his mind he's looking forward to the gospel time after his resurrection, after the time of his cross. Here's another one. John said about his baptism, it's got nothing to do with the Spirit, right? I baptize with water. One comes after me, baptized with the Holy Spirit with fire. Now, we're not. This might be opening up a can that we can't properly deal with right now. But in John 3, Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say to you, unless one is born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven." Well, how could anybody enter into the kingdom of heaven prior to Jesus sitting on the throne? How could anybody be born of above? Is what born again means, born from above, unless Jesus has been born from above. So Jesus oftentimes is speaking of his post-cross time when he's ascended into heaven after his resurrection. And notice exactly what he's saying here. This is what he says, I'm no longer in the world. And yet they themselves are in the world, and I come to you. Holy Father, keep them in your name, the name which you have given me, that they may be one even as we are. Now, just think about this. He says, I'm no longer in the world. Now we know this world was passing away. The form of it was passing away, and its lust thereof. And it was the last hour of its passing away in 1 John. All right? And the disciples are supposed to stay in the world. Now, let me show you one more passage. I'm going to make the connection, and then you're going to go, aha. Colossians chapter 2 now, and let's see. Verse 20. Now, the apostles, they were Jews. Those at Colossae, he's writing to them. People are trying to bring them under the law. They don't have any business doing the law at all. They are Gentiles. Colossians 2 verse 20, he says this. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourselves to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all things are destined to perish with use in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. So, all right, Jesus wasn't in the world. The Gentiles weren't in the world, but the apostles would remain in the world. He says, I don't want you to take them out of the world. Now, here's the picture. Here's the idea. The apostles were going to continue to labor as Jews under the law, but as Christians following Christ through faith, because if they didn't, they would never reach their fellow brothers and sisters that were Jews and bring them to be brothers and sisters in Christ. The Gentiles never were in that world, and so nobody should even bring him in that world, and yet they were living in their own world, right? And so this world has reference to the Jewish system, and their, as Gary was saying a while ago, their society, their people. When Jesus died on the cross, he died to the flesh. He died to the world below. And when he was resurrected into the world above, and then he said, I'm going to come to you. Now get this. Where's the Jerusalem in the New Testament? In New Testament times, where's the New Jerusalem? The Jerusalem's above. Revelation 21, where's Jerusalem come from? Comes from God out of heaven. Okay? So 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew 24:31, the gathering of the people, them being caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. What's he telling them? They're going to get out of the world below into the world above. They're going to get to join Jesus in that Jerusalem above. It's not a physical thing. Jesus said, I'm not in the world, but I'm going to come to you. He wasn't ascended at this point. He's talking about his post-resurrection time. Being in the world above with Jesus in the New Jerusalem has nothing to do with how high you can jump, or getting up on a stepladder to meet Jesus in the air. This has to do with your covenantal relationship with God. And so that world below, though, that world was passing away. But the apostles had remained in that world to fellowship those, to reach out to those people in the world, to be among them, so that they could bring them with them into this world above at the gathering of the saints to Christ. You got any comments or questions on that?
Yeah, that's a transformational change in relationship with God.
Right.
That Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, about verse 50 through 52.
Exactly. And
In the twinkling of an eye, we shall all be changed. Transformational change.
when
It's not
Daniel-
a physical change that people talk about.
So when Daniel talks about a kingdom is going to be created, an everlasting kingdom,
right.
he's talking about the church, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the church was established on the day of Pentecost,
All right.
right?
The word established might not be the best word, but it came into being, because here's why. When a child is born, that child's not established yet. You can't take that child and send it off to work. It has to grow and be nurtured and taken care of until it's ready to...
Okay, wrong is the word then, but
Yeah.
it came into being
Right.
on the day of Pentecost, right?
Right.
And so what you're saying is, and that is the new Jerusalem.
Okay. Right.
Church coming down from God as a bride adorning for her
Right.
husband. That's the church, right?
Right.
My point is, what I'm asking is, at what point did the church been established here on earth on the day of Pentecost? Then,
When did it get up to heaven?
when did, and you're saying that the
Right.
first century, these Christians that we're talking about here in the book is the ones that Jesus came to redeem under the law. And when did they join that church in heaven?
Notice he says this in John's... Yeah, I know what you're asking. I got you. But so read this verse real quick. John 17, verse 16. He says, they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. That Jerusalem above was their mother, but they were abiding in the world below to minister to their Jewish brothers and sisters, to get them out of it. So here, all right, this language that he's using is, we talk about up and down, up here, down here. It doesn't have anything to do with up and down. That's just the language it's used to paint us a picture in our mind. What he's talking about in the long run is, down here in this world below, it's a world of sin, it's a dominion of darkness, and the purpose of this imagery is Jesus is destroying and cleaning house in that world below, and it's passing away. And so this one now has replaced this one that's in the world below. Make sense? And so this imagery of it being above and coming down from heaven and things like that is just to paint a picture in our mind, and is not to be taken in the strictest literal of terms.
We use those terms like Keith introduced there. The church established at Pentecost. We understand the church began at Pentecost, but the church is established when, like Revelation 21:1. I looked and I saw new heaven, new earth, coming down as a bride adorned for her husband. That's the church in its fullness and its completion. It's established.
Johnny. Oh, sorry, Gary.
Right, and the question that Keith was asking, when I think it go all the way back to where we're coming up to now in Matthew chapter 24.
Right.
When all this take place, when the other son was kicked out of the house.
Yeah, right.
Then Christ had Jerusalem, everything and everything.
Right. He's clearing house so that the new saints can inhabit the promised land. It's transition into the spiritual. It's a lot of, we're dealing with spiritual things, and so the Bible's trying to paint us these pictures with physical terms. And it's, sometimes we have to remember that so we don't get caught up in it. And so they were not of the world. They were not of the world, but they were in the world. But there would be coming a time when they would be called up out of a world in which they did not belong, a world that was destined to fire. And that's what you see with the heavens and earth burning up in 2 Peter 3 and stuff like that. Even in Matthew 24, the stars falling from heaven, the powers of the heaven being shaken. It's all talking about the same kind of thing.
And also back to Corinthians, where Paul mentioned about we'll all be changed.
1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Where we'll all be changed, a twinkling of an eye, being separated then.
I take that. See, when I look at that, I take that as, for us, when we go down into the water river baptism,
Right.
change.
Exactly.
Automatically, it is not an event to later come, but when a person obeys the gospel, they're changed. They're transformed from, as Paul said, from the kingdom of darkness into the light.
Right.
You become,
It's like a birth.
yes,
Right.
You get baptized. You're being born into the faith.
Right, so consider it like this. Now we have, everything's been completed. In fact, talking about that word established, here's one just for your side notes. Hebrews 10:9 says that Jesus would take away the first to establish the second. Right, so it would be established whenever the first would be taken away. But so think about it like this. Whenever the saints were baptized in the first century, they were baptized looking forward to when Jesus would return and his presence would be with them, and they would know him truly, right, at that time, once the work of the Holy Spirit finished. And so their salvation process was an ongoing thing. Even in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verses 1 and following, it says through the gospel they were being saved. And they were looking for salvation at the day of Christ. Living on this side of the timeline, whenever we're baptized, when we obey the gospel, when we're born again, born from above, I should say, we now have everlasting life in its fullness automatically because of what God has accomplished for us and because the New Jerusalem is here. It's kind of like the difference between those who were born during the time of the wandering in the wilderness and those who were born in the promised land, right? We're those who are born in the promised land. The saints in the first century, when they were born again, or were born from above, they were born and they were still in the wandering of the wilderness. And so that's an interesting way to think about it. All right? Still Israelites, but they hadn't got what was promised yet. Still looking for it. Their reproach of Egypt had been taken away. That's what Joshua 5:9 says. The reproach of Egypt didn't roll away until they got into the promised land. Right, exactly.
That defines when it took place.
Right.
When Ishmael was cast out, leaving only Isaac, when the old law was finished, completely done, that's when the transformational change that those people had been waiting for or anticipating, that's when it was in its fullest.
That's exactly right.
And we take a look at that, we look at the 40 years that Jesus talked about this generation, from the time he began to preach,
Right.
to the time that the church was fully established, if I can use that word. There's 70, so you got that 40-year generation that Jesus was alluding to.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Any other comments or questions before we...
It's all in the allegory.
Right, that's right. And now we're done with our 2 to 3 minute introduction. So let's get... Yeah, let's get back to Matthew 24 then and finish it up. So Matthew 24, just to remind you, Jesus' outline for Matthew 24, comes from Old Testament prophets, but one of his most influential prophets that he quotes from is Daniel in Matthew 24:15. He quotes from, he makes references to the abomination of desolation spoken of both in Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 12 for our purposes. We also know Matthew 24:21 that this tribulation that he's addressing is one that would be greater than one that had ever taken place before, and one that would ever take place again. When you consider, the ratios, where ratios and percentages are concerned, there would never be another tribulation as great as the one that would happen during this time. Okay, and then going forward in Matthew 24:29 to 31, you see that this would be the time when the sun will be turned to darkness, the moon will not give its light. Those symbolic references to the collapse of a nation. And then the Son of Man would come on the clouds of the sky, and the saints would be gathered together by the angels. And that's where we get to verse 32. Do you have any questions about anything up to verse 32? All right. Now the introduction is done. 2 to 3 minutes at tops is done. All right. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Let me ask you a question. Was it near already? Didn't Jesus say the kingdom of heaven is at hand? John said that as well. So why does it say, when you see this, it'll be near? I thought it was already near. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And I like how this version says right at the door. So, here's the idea. Law of Moses had been in place for 1,500 years. Right? Okay, whenever John comes, speaking 40 years before the fall of Jerusalem, he says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All right? Now, you order something offline from Amazon, or you've got a friend that's coming to see you this Friday. Something like that. How long does it take for that friend to get there? And how long does it take for that package to come? You're sitting there every day. Oh, when are my new shoes going to get here? When's my new gun going to, when's my whatever going to get here? Or are you just sitting there even Thursday afternoon, you're looking out the door. Are they coming down the street yet? Where are they at? You get kind of anxious about that. See, because in the standpoint of redemption history, it was at hand. But in these apostles' lives, and these Christians' lives in the first century, they're sitting there thinking, man, is this ever going to happen? And some would even get discouraged and forget to watch. And so he says, when you see this, then you'll know it's near. You'll know it's right at hand. It's right here going to take place. And so like Ashley was saying, he was down the street, now he's at the door. I want to point out to you that he stands at the door. You can read about Jesus standing at the door somewhere else. Where's that? Exactly. It's Revelation, and what did you say it was? Chapter 3? Yep, chapter 3 and verse 20. But there's one more place I want to show you as well. But in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20, Jesus says this, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. All right. So Jesus in what Jesus and John in Revelation must be pulling from Jesus' discourse on the Mount of Olives, right? That's where he was speaking this message to them in Matthew 24. And so it must be closely related to that, the book of Revelation is. The point being is that here Jesus said, when you see these things, now I'll be at the door. Then Revelation 3, he's knocking. Ouch. I got this spot on my knuckle where I was working, and I rubbed my finger against the floor. And so that was dumb of me to knock on the desk like that. Next place I want you to look at is James 5, 8 and 9. This is probably even more of a direct reference than the Revelation one was. Not that the Revelation one wasn't. This reference is just even more obvious. James 5, 8 and 9. This is great. He tells them that, let's start in verse 7, because this is even better. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until he gets the early and late rains. I'm going to talk about that in a second. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge standing right at the door. How about that? How's that not a direct reference to the Matthew 24, right? James is saying what Jesus said was going to happen, here it is. It was going to be near back then when he said these signs would be seen, and now we know that it is. That's amazing to me. I want to talk about these late rains and these early rains for a moment. These late rains and these early rains, we're experiencing them in a sense right now, are we not? Right. No, but in their day, the early rains and the latter rains marked the time of the harvest seasons. And I want to show you something from the book of Hosea. Let's go look chapter 6. We're going to read chapter 5, and then verse 15, verses 14 and 15, through chapter 6 and verse 3. Hosea chapter 5, 14 through 6 and verse 3. Hosea 5, 14, 15. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I will tear to pieces and go away. I will carry away, and there will be none to deliver. So just right there, he's talking about future judgment on Judah and Israel that would take place, one by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. That's what he's directly addressing. And he says this, verse 15, I will go away and return to my place. Now this is Jesus, this is the image of God, rather, leaving the temple. He's no longer in the presence among his people. They have forsaken him, so he's going back to his place. Until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. In their affliction, they will earnestly seek me. And here's what they're going to say. Verse 1, chapter 6. Come, let us return to the Lord. For he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but he will bandage us. He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up on the third day, that we may live before him. Wait, third day resurrection. You know that this is the only place in the Old Testament that mentions specifically a resurrection on the third day? That goes to show you. That's Hosea 6 verse 2. Verse 2. The only place in the Old Testament that mentions the third day resurrection. I'm going to show you why that's significant in just a second, but let's keep going. So let us know, let us press on to the Lord. His going forth is as certain as the dawn. He will come to us like the rain, like the spring rain watering the earth. Somebody that has an alternate translation of that, read it for me, please. Verse 3.
Let us know, let us press on to the Lord. He goeth out, his going out is sure as the dawn. He will come unto us as the showers, as a spring rain, that the waters of the earth, the water of the earth.
All right, thank you. Yes, it's a little different. Let me read to you from the New King James Version. You in the King James might have this rendition as well. Let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rains of the earth. And so there's a little bit of differences between those. And I'm not exact. I never noticed that difference before. I guess I've never looked at that particular passage in my version of the Bible that I've just started using here recently. But notice the idea, though, is that his going forth to us is going to be like the rains that come upon the earth. The King James, New King James, like the latter rain and the former rain. Same thing that James says in James chapter 5, like the latter rain and the former rain. The picture is, though, is that that God's coming to heal us is built upon this sort of outline of the latter rains and the former rains. Let me tell you why that's significant. Because what takes place in these times? The feast days. The festal calendar is built around when the latter rains and when the former rains would come. And some people see this as a clear reference to Jesus fulfilling, to God fulfilling the types and shadows of the feast days in the New Testament through his death, burial, and resurrection, but also through his coming again to fulfill the fall feast days, like we talked about a while back. But I want to just mention real quick this second verse, why it's important. He'll revive us after 2 days. He'll raise us up on the third day, that we may live before him. Turn in your Bible just quick to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 3 and 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 and 4. So in other words, Israel's going to be restored through a third-day resurrection. And this restoration will be patterned after the early rains and the latter rains. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. For I delivered to you as first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he's raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4. There's only one place in the Old Testament that talks about a third-day resurrection. It's Hosea 6, verse 2. What he's showing us, though, is that Jesus' resurrection on the third day, he mentions this very specifically, so that we know what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 15. Let me show you this, though. He starts off his entire little spiel here about the resurrection, making a veiled reference to Hosea chapter 6 and verse 2. And notice what he does at the very end. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 55. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Do you know what he's quoting from there? Hosea 13 and 14, right? His entire 1 Corinthians 15 is built upon something that's being talked about in Hosea. And we know what that is. And that is the resurrection, the restoration of Israel out of spiritual death and into life and presence with Christ. Let me show you one more reference to Hosea that's in this at the least. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 36, 37. You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. That which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or something else. Okay, this sowing that takes place. God specific. By the way, that which you sow does not quicken unless it dies. Please make sure that when I die, or when you go to bury me, that I'm actually dead. Don't put me in the ground waiting for me to die. But see, this is based off something that God did to Israel. In Hosea chapters 1 and 2, Hosea has these kids. He has one named Jezreel. He has one named Lo-Ami, and another was Laruhamah. Means God. No more my children, no more mercy. And then Jezreel means God plants or God sows. Wait, what did I say? God plants or God sows. Look at Hosea chapter 1 for a moment. And notice what he says in verses 10 and 11. Specifically here for our purposes, verse 11. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. This is the harvest that comes about because of this original planting. This is when they would come up out of the land, in a sense.